Welcome wherever you are on this dark December evening. For those in the lower mainland, I hope you're surviving this atmospheric river. Um, today, I'll first quickly introduce the FHABC, and then I'll talk about the speaker series, and then I'll introduce our guest. About the FHABC, the Forest History Society, our Association of British Columbia, has been active since 1982. And we promote the preservation, appreciation, and deeper consideration of BC's past. Our current programs include a long-running newsletter, an online book club. We're currently just finished this book, HR, a biography of H.R. Macmillan, which was wonderful. Keep your eyes on our website and your emails to hear what we'll be reading next. This speaker series and other programs. We're currently looking for new members, so please consider joining us. Dues are only $20 a year, I think less, $50 for three, and they enable all the work we do. They keep us going, our servers, and our materials, and enable our projects. We're also seeking new directors, editors, social media managers, and really anyone with new projects that deserve to be explored. Please join us. About the speaker series. In order to be in proper dialogue with the present, we need to learn about the past. It's the purpose of this speaker series to understand the motivating spirit of other times so that we may be better informed in our own. The fall speaker series seeks to uplift a diversity of voices so that we may better understand our past together. We meet monthly through the fall, generally on the third Tuesday of every month, so here we are. Please keep an eye on our website for future talks, or if you become a member, have updates sent to your email directly. We're also going to have a few talks this spring, sort of opportunistically, so keep your eyes out for that. It's an honor today to welcome Keith Moore, our speaker for the evening. Keith is a registered professional forester in BC and a longtime resident of Haida Gwaii. He began his forest career in the research branch of the Ministry of Forest before moving to the BC Ministry of Environment. He spent 10 years with the MOE before starting off a consulting career and has worked all over BC, Canada, and mostly internationally in the first 10 years. And it was amazing, Keith, reading all the places you've been. I see here Borneo, Amazon, the Congo. So you're really lucky to be able to see all those things. I'm sure we'll hear, well, we may not hear a little bit today. But I was excited to see that recently you've had a unique opportunity to study the long history of regulation in British Columbia, which brings us to his title, How the Long History of Forest Practice Regulation in BC Became a Key Part in a Recent BC Supreme Court Case. And with that, I'll pass it over, Keith.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you so much first to you for inviting me to do this. It's been a lot of fun. And second to all those folks who have joined us on a rainy Tuesday evening. I'm talking to you from my home office. And as I say, high atop Hippie Hill in downtown Daajing Giids in Haida Gwaii. Um, I've titled this How the Long History of Forest Practices Regulation in BC Became a Key Part of a Court Case. And I will walk you through how this came to be, what I learned, what the history of forest practices regulation might look like. And Alan, I appreciated in your introduction, you said to sort of understand where we're going, we need to have some appreciation of our past. And I think that's very true in the case of forest practices regulation. So my next slide here is just a little bit more about me. And as Alan has told you, I'm very lucky. I do work all over the world. That's my current employment. But Haida Gwaii is very much my home. It's my community. It's very much formed me as a forester. It's been the site of a whole lot of exciting and tumultuous events over the last 40 plus years that I've lived here. And what I'm going to try and lay out this evening is a little bit of a story of some of those events, my involvement in them, and how that then somehow led me to be asked to document the history of forest practices regulation in BC over the last 150 years. And maybe Alan, I could just do a sound check. Is this working okay at this point?
You're good to me. If he doesn't sound good to anyone, please let me know in the chat. You sound great here, Keith.
Thank you. Okay, so that's about me. That was a very nice bio that you put together, Alan. Thank you. And I've lived in Haida Gwaii for just over 40 years. People tend to think of Haida Gwaii as a place of a lot of conflict, and we have certainly had our share of what were called conflicts. But for me, we're very much more about reconciliation. And when I look at the events of the last few years, I look at the famous battles in Gwaii, South Moresby, 1974 to 1986, and the Haida Gwaii, the Lyle Island blockades in 85. But those led to the Gwaii Agreement in 1993, an agreement between the Haida Nation and the Government of Canada. It was really the first co-management agreement in Canada. It's now looked at worldwide. And it was an agreement about how to work together for common objectives while disagreeing fundamentally about the title, who owned the land. And while we agree to disagree about that, we have some basic fundamental principles we agree on. Let's emphasize those. Let's work together. And that's pretty much, in my view, been the spirit on Haida Gwaii pretty much to the present. A second conflict time was around 2000. A lot of unrest about log exports, about landslides, about protests of sustainability, AAC, and a day-long demonstration brought out about 600 people in a population of 4,000 to protest, to launch then a massive community feast where everybody from every community came together to talk about what they could do. That led to a government recognition in the provincial side that things weren't going well. They needed to break some barriers, and they signed a protocol with the Council of Haida Nation as equal partners on embarking on land use planning and doing some interim measures in the meantime. This was a big step because prior to that, some of you may remember the uh, LRUP processes, the land and resource management plans, pretty much driven by the province in which the First Nations were minor parts or bystanders or stakeholders, and that was never going to fly on Haida Gwaii and never did fly on Haida Gwaii. A much more co-managed approach was necessary. So in 2003, between the province and the Haida Nation, they launched the Community Planning Forum. This operated for about 18 months, and it was terminated with a lack of consensus in early 2005. Broad scale agreement, but not full consensus. And between the two governments, they decided to cancel the process. And that led to another blockade called the Island Spirit Rising blockade in 2005. This one was pretty substantial, lasted about 8 weeks, but it demonstrated just broad and uniform community-wide frustration with lots of issues. And again, the two governments sat down and began a direct government to government negotiation to try to address their differences, to try to agree on harvesting practices, protected areas, a whole suite of things. And in 2007, they signed a strategic land use agreement. It was built on three basic themes: zoning, ecosystem-based management for the operational landscape, and a governance model that reflected the differences of opinion about who actually owned the land. And that kicked off a whole bunch of bi-party, detailed strategic planning initiatives, different teams of people working on all those three themes. I was fortunate enough to be a central part of these agreements, and much of what I'm going to share with you today comes about from my participation in those negotiations. Finally, we reached some agreement. We reached an endpoint in 2009. The government, province, and the Haida Nation signed the Kunstagu Kunstaya Reconciliation Protocol. And in 2010, they built on that to create legislation. And so in the provincial legislature, the province adopted the Haida Gwaii Reconciliation Act and the Haida Gwaii Land Use Objectives Order, which built on all that work over the previous 8 or 9 years. And both of those pieces of legislation were also simultaneously adopted in the Haida House of Assembly, which is the Haida Nation's government. The most important parts, there were multiple parts here, but the most important parts um, were to return the name Queen Charlotte Islands to the Queen. And what we say on Haida Gwaii was we were briefly known as the Queen Charlotte Islands. We are now known as Haida Gwaii. The, uh, these two agreements created the co-management joint decision-making framework where both governments are equal parties in viewing applications for cutting permits for all forms of land act, other forms of tenure, and they have a process to jointly agree and jointly sign off on all those approvals. It also created an institution called the Haida Gwaii Management Council, which was the governing body for all of these lower level decision-making tables. And that body was empowered with the responsibility of making AAC determinations for Haida Gwaii. I believe we're still the only place in BC where that authority has been delegated by the chief forester to, or not delegated, the authority of the chief forester has been replaced by a different entity, which here is called the Haida Gwaii Management Council. And the land use order established 20 legally binding objectives um, or broadly ecosystem-based management, but they dealt cultural objectives, rare and medicinal plants, culturally modified trees, monumental cedar, aquatic habitats, streams, watersheds, biodiversity, ecosystem representation networks, and several species of wildlife. So this was a really significant achievement. It was really significant for us here on Haida Gwaii. It brought us some peace, some stability. It was what we'd all been looking for. It was a culmination of bi-party cooperation. It was an agreement to work together and to get past the impasse that might have been created because of court cases related to title. It was a really significant achievement. Many people were part of it. It was widely celebrated here. And it was the start on Haida Gwaii of a regime that's sort of continued to the near present, in which all these plans are approved by governments and all the operations have to meet the requirements of the land use order. Of course, that protocol from 2009, Kunstagu Kunstaya, in Haida, it means the beginning of the beginning, and it has been the beginning. It's been a building block. Lots of steps along the way since 2009 and culminating in the recognition of Haida title in 2024. And I use the word recognition. This was not a situation where the Haida were granted title or awarded title. It was a situation in which the long-standing uh, title of the Haida Nation was recognized by the Crown. That had never been preempted or ceded or given up. And so we are now in 2025 working on a situation where I live on Haida land and I recognize the long-term existence of Haida title here. But that's for today. This is a history presentation. And so the last sort of event in this little summary of the history of conflict and reconciliation on Haida Gwaii was the AAC determination, the first one that was released by the Haida Gwaii Management Council in 2012. And after a lot of work and a process that, again, I was very fortunate to take a leadership role in, the Management Council determined that the AAC for Haida Gwaii, all of Haida Gwaii, building in all the requirements and constraints associated with the land use order would be 929,000 cubic meters. And that was indeed a reduction of about 50% from the previous period where it had been 1.8 million. And that was also a reduction from a previous period where it had been up around 2.6 million. Um, just a technical point, the Management Council did the AAC determination for Haida Gwaii, but it was left to the Chief Forester to do the allocation amongst the various tenure holders here. So that sort of concludes the little bit of a history that I'm now going to move forward from. And that takes us to a court case. There was a company with tenures on Haida Gwaii that challenged these, I'll call them achievements, maybe not the right term, but they challenged the status quo, the new regime that emerged from those achievements. And one of their legal challenges was that the forest tenures that they had acquired conferred on them a form of property interest. And the land use order, by the measures that it had put in place to protect those four themes, those, they argued, took away their rights to conduct their businesses by prohibiting some activities in some areas, and that included streams and watersheds, marble murrelet habitat, etc. And it had also had the effect of reducing the harvest on their tenures. That was the allocation from the chief forester. And fundamentally then, that the land use order and the cut reduction diminished their property value associated with their tenure. And in law, this apparently is a legal argument around what's called constructive expropriation or constructive taking. Somebody explained it to me that it's somewhat like constructive dismissal in a human employment situation. Something was taken away from you for somebody else's interests, and you should be eligible to compensation. And in this case, the company sought $75 million from the BC Crown and the Haida Gwaii Management Council. And I should say that I'm obviously not a lawyer, and I hope that this makes sense to me, to you. This is the way this argument around constructive expropriation has been explained to me. I'll provide you some references at the end of the talk if you would like to pursue this further. But anyway, here we go, a big court case. And indeed, it was a really big court case. It turned out to be one of the longest, I think the third longest in the history of the BC Supreme Court. It was incredibly elaborate. It was active over about a 10-year period. Ultimately, there were 64 days of time in the BC Supreme Court where, typically a week or 2 weeks is a pretty good court case. This one took 64 days of court time. It had many, many witnesses. There was tens and tens of thousands of pages of evidence. But it was very much potentially precedent setting because it involved the issues of changing operations of forest companies, mining companies, et cetera, on Crown land where they had been granted tenures. And so a lot of people were watching this case. And I became one of the many Crown witnesses. Just to fast forward to the end of the story, there was a decision in March of 2025, close to 10 years after it started. The judgment was resoundingly in favor of the Crown and the Haida Gwaii Management Council, and it completely rejected all three of the company arguments that they had advanced in support of their claim of 75 million, but it especially and completely rejected the argument of constructive expropriation or constructive taking. There has been no appeal. The appeal period has passed, so this judgment stands. And it's expected in legal circles that this will be a decision that affects other land use decisions and other similar challenges to government's right to make those type of changes in the future. I'm going to move on now to just talk about how I got involved and what I was then asked to do. Um, but I would be happy if there's questions at this point. I could take a quick break and answer any questions that might arise.
Just feel free to jump on in, anybody.
Keith,
Yes,
it's Ron. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Ron.
Bronstein.
Oh, Mr. Branstein, how are you, my friend?
Very good. Glad to see you.
Yes, good. Well, I'm actually focused on a screen here. I'm going to turn on cameras when I
Okay.
get to the question period. Yeah, great. Go ahead.
So, are you going to divulge the name of the company?
I would
Is
rather
that
not.
no?
It's not really a part of the presentation. I don't need to divulge them. It's all in the public record. I'll provide you with the judgment and the newspaper clippings that followed it if you like.
Yeah, sure. That was fine. Thanks.
Any more, or should I proceed? I'll proceed. So how did I get involved? This seems a bit of a stretch for me, but one of the Crown's responses to this claim of constructive expropriation was along the lines of, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so this is my paraphrasing of their argument and what they asked me to support. But basically, they wanted to argue that the Crown, the province, the Minister of Forests, whoever, always has a right and an obligation to regulate operations on forest tenures. That's just kind of what they do. And they have been doing that for many, many years. And essentially, that's what they were doing on Haida Gwaii. Over the years, there had been constant changes in the rules, the whole way in which companies got to conduct operations. And those constant changes reflected new research, new information, changing social values, changing interests of the Crown, new priorities. And they held on to the right to make changes in response to all those changing circumstances that they had to deal with as they were managing forests for all the people that own them. And they wanted to argue, I guess, that the implementation of the land use order and the reduced harvest in 2012, actually, sorry, typo, reduced harvest in 2012 that had been made by the Management Council was just another one of those changes. Really just a part of a long and constant and continuous evolution of the forest management responsibilities of the Crown. And so they really wanted somebody to put together a document for them that would document that long, constant evolution change in the nature of the rules which govern forest management. And on that basis, a friend was kind enough to recommend me to Crown Counsel, and I was then retained as a Crown witness. And I was asked to document not just for Haida Gwaii, but for the whole of British Columbia, in some significant detail, the long and ever-evolving regulatory environment that would support the Crown's argument that would defeat the uh, argument related to constructive expropriation. And so I actually had a wonderful time doing this. I ended up preparing a very long chronological document. I prepared a very legally based affidavit. And then I got to testify that all of that. And 2 days in a courtroom and cross-examination by some of the top lawyers in the province, and it was actually a very rewarding experience. And so I'm now going to just try to go ahead here for you and outline a little bit about what I found out about that history, much of which I knew, some of which I'd been involved in, but it's actually a pretty powerful history. It's over 150 years long. And I think I can see it's taken lots of forms and it's been a roller coaster, lots of, you know, periods of a bit of stability and then a fairly dramatic change and then a bit more stability and then another evolution. And I divided this, and I did this more for my own interest rather than anything I presented in court, but I divided this into 7 discrete phases over the last 150 years. And I'll just try to run those by you now. Quickly, phase 1 is from the unregulated heyday to some regulation, but largely driven around timber, an approach that came into vogue in the 60s called integrated use, moving into multiple use in the 70s, enhanced forest stewardship and ecosystem-based management in the 90s, the Forest Practices Code in the 90s, FERPA in 2004, and then an interesting question, if we learn from the past where we're going, where are we going? What does the next phase look like? So I'll just try to run through this for you now. So as I said, the first phase bringing regulation to the unregulated. The first provisions related to land management, forest management were actually in the Land Act in 1870. Prior to that date, people were just sold or granted land. In 1870, the Land Act regulated who could get them and what the purposes were. But there were still sales occurring under that legislation. Those ended in about 1896, and after that time, there were only leases. There was still unhappiness about that situation, so the first Royal Commission was in 1909, a guy called Fred Fulton, and he was asked to investigate all matters concerning timber resources. And he did focus very much on timber, and the recommendations that came out of his commission focused very much on the management of a timber resource. But he did create the Forest Service. He did establish some tenures, and he was quite interested in establishing regulations for fire protection and wood waste utilization. He did mention regulating stream flows and was concerned about erosion, but there were no specifics or any kind of recommendations related to the environment. It was very much focused on his mandate, which was timber resources. And following up on Fulton, the first Forest Act was 1912, and that did bring in the types of tenures and regulated the location and the methods of harvesting. That was a period of some fair stability, but also of rapid growth based around the system that Fulton had recommended and that was in that Forest Act. And so by the time end of the war, Second Forestry Royal Commission, Justice Gordon Sloan, was an attempt to address some of the issues around growth. So it did look at sustainability, it did bring in a concept of an annual allowable cut, and it did support silviculture as a necessary requirement. It made, again, passing reference to the importance of watersheds and wildlife, etc., but there were still no specifics. And again, the primary focus was on a tenure system to achieve a sustainable yield. Excuse me, the Second Forest Act logically followed Sloan. And again, it was largely based around tenures. There's not much there that I thought would interest a judge in terms of environmental regulation. The Third Royal Commission, 1955, the second Sloan one, and this was more about corporate concentration and the lack of reforestation, but there was still a focus more on timber supply. This was the first one that included a terms of reference that would have allowed them to, Mr. Sloan to Chief Justice Sloan, I guess, properly, to focus on non-timber values. They were included in the terms of reference, but those were not picked up or addressed in the text. That took us to, oops, what am I doing here? Approximately the 60s. And this is where phase two began to begin. And around the province in the 60s, specifically related to damage to salmon stocks, was becoming a more prominent concern. And a hydrology prophet, UVic, I called Dr. Walt Jeffrey, who I never had the pleasure of meeting. He was commissioned by the federal government and he put out a paper called An Integrated Forest Management Approach. And this was, again, from the federal government, largely related to salmon stocks, but it described a much bolder, much newer, um, much more in recognition of multiple values and resources in a forest. And this apparently, I wasn't here at this point, but this got some traction. And in 1970, it led directly from a couple people who had been students of Walt Jeffrey to the establishment of the Carnation Creek Watershed Research Project. This was really the first place in BC. There were precedents in the US, of course, but there was the first place in BC where we looked at the implications and the interactions and the impacts between forest harvesting and fish habitat. And we looked at different ways to reduce and manage those impacts. I think it's reasonable to expect that it was the same kind of players who were leading the developments in Carnation Creek, who were also part of the Vancouver District Office of the Forest Service. And they brought out what really were the very first set of environmental regulations for forestry in BC. Those were called the Planning Guidelines for Coast Logging Operations, 1972. And those established requirements for leaf strips along streams. They set an 80-hectare maximum size on cut blocks. And most controversially, they required a checkerboard pattern of alternative patches so that 80-hectare clear cuts would be offset against each other, marching up a watershed. They could not be side by side. They had to be opposite. And this was also a partly, I understand, in relation to theories about fire breaks, and you should have fire breaks between all of your larger cut blocks. Anyway, that was the first set of guidelines. 1973, the Forest Service, and again in the research branch, I believe, began the NAMINT Watershed Integrated Resource Study, an interagency planning project, NAMINT watershed on the west coast of Vancouver Island. So this is, I'm trying to, this period in the late 60s, early 70s, things were beginning to happen on environmental regulation. The Forest Service introduced a thing called the P clause in all its cutting permits, and it required retention of all immature and non-nurturable and leaning trees along streams. And I actually knew this one really well. This became the starting point of my master's thesis at UBC. Same time frame, 1975, 1976, the Fourth Royal Commission, Peter Pearce. This one heard a lot of submissions around non-timber values. But Pearce himself, I think, was primarily focused on tenure, regulation, crown revenue, incentives for management. Many of the sort of fundamental principles related to sound forest management from a utilization, a timber and a revenue and a security of tenure and an investment perspective. But he did devote some time in responding to what he heard into outlining a concept of planning to achieve what he called multiple use. And I think this was a different phase that we moved into at this point compared to the Jeffrey approach of integrated use. And Pearce spends some time working on the folio system. I might be getting close to the time where some of you folks out there listening might even have been part of some of these things. But the folio system basically said you mapped all your values and you overlaid them in a folio system where you could see where things intersected, where values were high, where values were low. And hopefully out of that, you could end up planning for multiple uses with all of the various values that you would have identified in your folio. There was other things happening in the late period, the late 70s as well. There was an amendment to the Federal Fisheries Act, I forget the name, C-33 maybe, brought in the habitat protection provisions. And this kicked off the legal requirement to consider fish habitat in operations. There had been a lot of concern about that checkerboard pattern in the coast planning guidelines and about the mandatory leaf strips along larger streams. There was a lot of talk about blowdown. And again, at this point, I was a graduate student. I spent my first summer as a graduate student looking at blowdown on Vancouver Island. My first publication was about blowdown. And then in the next year, I was hired by the research branch of the Ministry of Forests to try to develop what was called a site-specific approach rather than a uniform P clause along streams. There was a famous statement by, I believe, a chief forester in those days who said he had to move away from the pantyhose approach, which he described as a one-size-fits-all approach. And he was very much in favor of a site-specific approach, and somehow I got hired to figure out site-specific ways to recognize different types of streams and different types of slopes, different types of situations, different fisheries values. And I then developed something that was used for a few years on Vancouver Island called the decision-making procedure for streamside management. And up here on Haida Gwaii, when I began to work up here, streamside management methods for the Queen Charlotte Islands. My friends David Taves and David Wilford were busy as hydrologists working on hydrology and rate of cut guidelines. They brought in the first set, the first recommendations for 35% of a watershed, no more than 35% cut over a 25-year period. It was also the period on Haida Gwaii of landslides, the famous Riley Creek controversy, and the Fish Forestry Interaction Program. And this then led to the development of guidelines for limits of steep slope logging, road construction, culvert placement, ditching, et cetera, et cetera. DFO, responding probably to the fish habitat requirements, brought in a new handbook. By this time, the Carnation Creek project was 10 years old, and in 1987 it was 15 years old, and there were two very substantial workshops, brought together many of the players in forestry, and there was agreement at the second one to develop comprehensive guidelines that came to be known as the Coastal Fish Forestry Guidelines, the CFFG. And probably there's a few people on the call like me who sat in rooms and struggled hard and became friends with many of our adversaries and developed versions 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the Coastal Fisheries Forestry Guidelines. At the same time, Wilford was moving on, and the Coastal Watershed Assessment Procedure became a thing that was required. Bottom line, there was a lot of good ideas here. A lot of research was being done. A lot of things were being incorporated. Again, changing values, things were being done differently. But all of the developments in this phase led to guidelines or recommended methods. They were not enforceable. There was nothing to back them up. They were basically voluntary. And this came to light in a series of audits that were done by a guy called Derek Tripp in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. Came to be known as the Tripp reports. And anybody that was working in forestry at that point on the coast probably knew about Derek Tripp and his landmark reports. I think that Tripp was about the end of that period of multiple use and voluntary guidelines. There was a fourth phase, I think, began about 1991. And rather than having a royal commission, which many people were calling for, which presumably would have been a single commissioner or a three-person commission, the government of the day decided to put together a much larger commission, including people representing the huge diversity of interests in the forest from around the province. So I'm just off the top of my head, forest sector interests, wildlife interests, um, ranching interests, salmon interests. And they put together the Forest Resources Commission, which was led by a fellow called Sandy Peel. They held hearings around the province. I believe it began about 89. And they wrote an incredibly ambitious report, 1991, which was called A Vision for Enhanced Stewardship for Economic, Environmental, Social, and Spiritual Well-Being of British Columbia. They took their mandate seriously. They heard a lot because this was a very hot period, much public engagement. They proposed 108 recommendations for change, and they brought in through their recommendations a lot of changes. One that's remembered is the recommendation which kind of followed up on Tripp, which was to produce a legal framework, a forest practices code. And Sandy Peel's commission led in late 1991 to the first forest practices code discussion paper. But the whole concept of enhanced stewardship, I don't know whether it made it better or worse, but it led to an absolute proliferation of guidelines for non-timber values. In my files, I had over 15 of these things because I'd been trying to work with them as a consultant in those days. There were guidelines for managing marble murrelets, ecosystem networks, biological diversity, landslide-prone terrain. There was a new set of planning guidelines. There were wildlife trees, visual landscapes, karst caves. Everybody had a new guideline. None of them ever got much past the draft stage, but those of us that were working were supposed to be paying heed to them. And that kind of, I think, probably was part of the, I want to call it chaos, but I probably shouldn't. That also led to the establishment of the Forest Practices Code in 95, which tried to take on all of these things. Sandy Peel didn't stop with just environmental guidelines. He was the proponent for CORE, the Commission on Resources and Environment. He was the proponent of the Old Growth Strategy Project, the Protected Area Strategy Project, and all of those were very active things in the early 1990s. And again, I'm sure quite a few of us on this call sat in some capacity on the old growth or the protected areas or had interactions with CORE. The last part, I think, of this enhanced stewardship and ecosystem-based management probably was 1993, the creation of the science panel, Clayoquot Sound Science Panel. I think for anybody, you have to be an old guy like me to remember the genesis here, but the 90s, the late 80s, the early 90s, a time of blockades all over the province. Everybody had a favorite watershed they were protecting, the last of the unlogged watersheds. There were many of them. Clayoquot Sound became maybe the most prominent, certainly the biggest. Most people were arrested. The biggest number of arrests in Canadian history up until more recent times, which has been surpassed quite a lot. But the premier of the province of the day decided the way out of this was to establish a protected area over part of Clayoquot Sound and to constitute a panel to make the forest practices in Clayoquot Sound the best in the world. And this was led by Dr. Fred Bunnell at UBC and Richard Atleo from the Nuu-chah-nulth First Nation. Significantly to me, when I look back, this was, I believe, the first time that First Nations people had really been directly engaged in these processes that were very much around forest practices and land use planning. And Premier, it was Harcourt in his day, he appointed first 4 New Chalmette representatives on this planning team. And it was an eye opener to me. Um, First, I was, shocked that we had never done this before. And then I was amazed at the value that these 4 Indigenous representatives brought to our process. Um, Science panel, as many of you probably know, it introduced the concept of ecosystem management, where timber inventory, timber opportunity was an outcome, an output of the planning system, not an input to it. And it was first priority, protect ecosystem values, and then to determine from there what was available for harvest and over what time frame. The ecosystem was called ecosystem management in the Clayoquot panel days. It quickly morphed into ecosystem-based management because the science panel had not been given any mandate to deal with community interests or social interests, economic interests at the community level. And so the term quickly changed to be ecosystem-based management, and the concept of protecting an ecosystem also factored in protection of human values. And that there was a whole nother side development that I did not get into, which another kind of competing theme developed, but we won't go there today. The Clayoquot Sound ecosystem-based management became the starting point for land use planning teams that were being established on the BC coast, 3 of them, the North Coast, Central Coast, and Haida Gwaii. And in order to support the development of ecosystem-based management, the Coast Information Team was put together with funding from the industry, government, and NGOs, and became quite a large institution which would support the concept of developing ecosystem-based management in these 3 areas. There were 2 things going on in parallel here. One was the Clayoquot Sound approach to ecosystem-based management, and a much more cautious approach, which was led by the province in terms of developing prescriptive regulation to bring an end to that period of voluntary guidelines and unenforceable standards. And I think in large part because of the proliferation of things that had suddenly began to need to be guided as a result of the Sandy Peel Commission, the Forest Practices Code then took on the huge range of forest management issues and developed a very comprehensive set of legal requirements, minimum legal requirements across a huge range of interests. Obviously, the code established the Forest Practices Board, which I had the honor and pleasure of leading for its first 5 years. And it also developed many supporting guidebooks, which in some ways became the Achilles heel of the code, but in other ways were very valuable resource documents in their way in articulating some very valuable scientific understanding of the types of things it took to really manage forests based on an ecosystem management approach. The code, of course, was not the end of it. New developments continued to come. On Haida Gwaii, we developed, I believe, the first set of guidelines for culturally modified trees. And again, as I look back, it was kind of shocking that we hadn't had these in place many years previous, because clearly these trees qualified as archaeological values under the archaeological requirements of BC, but many of them were not protected, were not ignored, and became a flashpoint for First Nations, especially here on Haida Gwaii. Goshawk became a hot button issue here. Marble murrelet's all up and down the coast. We also got new regulations around protection of Pacific yew and crabapple. So even though the code was sort of supposed to be the platform, it wasn't really the end. Things kept happening. And in addition, on the coast, through the land use planning processes, ecosystem-based management was getting traction and was influential in developing the land use orders that came to pass and supplemented the code in those areas. The last phase that I'm going to recognize, because this is kind of where my frame of reference ended for the judge, was FERPA, of course, Forest and Range Practices Act, 2004. And this was a very conscious move away from the prescriptive type approach that was in the Forest Practices Code, and it took a more objective, results-based approach, defining objectives and then requiring licensees to develop proposed activities that would meet those objectives that would then be monitored. And approach from the government-led approval and implementation process of the code, the government approval process that was a central part of the code. This moved away from that, took responsibility away from statutory decision makers and gave much more responsibility to Reliance. I think we're probably still in this results-based professional reliance phase. There's obviously been developments recently, but I think that one of the interesting questions then is, since my thesis here is that this is not static, this doesn't last long. We go through phases and then things go through an evolution or a change. So what's going to be the next phase? I think we maybe are already seeing some of that in the new developments, which I confess to not being very familiar with, around forest landscape planning. But I also think, and I see it in my work, we're going to have to figure out a way to creatively and constructively collaborate and engage with First Nations. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the provincial legislation around DRIPA, international concepts around free, prior, and informed consent, reconciliation. These are all, I think, powerful drivers of what we're going to see, maybe already starting to see in the near term around the regulation of activities by forest companies in a forest landscape. And the third one is more or less my own personal perspective, having worked in many jurisdictions around the world and having worked in certification programs where we still do not do a very good job. The Forest Practices Code, FERPA, pretty silent on how do we treat the people who live in communities that depend on forest resources for livelihood, culture, recreation, et cetera, et cetera. We're still pretty focused. And I see other jurisdictions, and maybe some of these are not great examples, but even in Ontario, and especially in the certification requirements of the Forest Stewardship Council that I work with, good forest stewardship very much includes the consideration and the absolute positive, appropriate consultation and engagements with communities in terms of their social and cultural needs from the forest. That's about it for me. I hope you've enjoyed this little path. I have a couple of reflections for you. I do want to point out that in the end, after all the great work that I did in preparing an immense submission for her, the judge's decision was entirely on the legal arguments that the lawyers, of course, had advanced. There are some passing comments about the constant evolution of forest practices. She does very much describe that process for Haida Gwaii, but it's not really a part of her decision on constructive expropriation. That's very much in the law that's emerging across Canada on that theme. The lawyers did make me feel good. They did tell me that the chronology was influential, but I think they were basically going on the judge's body language while she was sitting listening to us all. For me, it was a really fascinating task. I had been involved in some of this, certainly since the 70s. It was a great opportunity to, on one level, get paid, but on another level, to contribute to putting this together. And I realized I was really lucky. I just happened to be in grad school in 1974 when this was all happening. I was in my first year in grad school when I got to sit, listen and watch Peter Pierce at the Pierce Commission and all the incredibly bright people that were testifying there. It was great theater, but if things inspire you to a career, sitting in the Pierce Commission in the Van Dusen Gardens in Queen Elizabeth Park in Vancouver was certainly a huge inspiration for me. And, I guess I just have been really lucky. I have been a part of most of what I described, and I met some terrific people along the way, from working on the planning guidelines, the fish forestry guidelines, the Clackwood panel, evolution of EBM management on Haida Gwaii. Really lucky. Whoops, there we go. Our perspectives on what's good forestry have changed a lot, mostly since the 70s. And there's been a hell of a lot of new research, new values, changing priorities. So it's only reasonable to expect that this is an ongoing evolution. I realize, when I look at it, how recent our recognition of First Nations rights and the knowledge and contributions that First Nations people can bring. It's very recent. It's embarrassing on one level. And I really think this is a theme that we are going to see much more in our next phase of how we do this. For me, what I learned, the constant is change. There's more coming. And I'm happy to have been part of this court case because it's been really important, I think, because the ability to implement change is not going to be stymied by arguments like constructive expropriation. I put together, there's a short list here where you can find the judgments or where you can find press reports. I'd be happy to share any or all of these with you. You should have my email. If you don't, it's easy. It's MRM for Moore Resource Management, MRM at haidagwaii.ca. And with that, I'll say, Hewa, and thank you.